What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy and welcome back to another entry into our Rogue Rumble series, and this time we're going to be taking a look at Quad Wobbuffet. This is the same deck that I went over actually in my North American Internationals tournament report, so if you guys actually want to hear how I did with this deck at Internationals, I'll be sure to put a link for you guys to check that out. And before we get too heavy into this video, I just want to give a quick shout out that we did have a couple items in our online store that were out of stock, and we actually just restocked them, and we have I think one or two new things on there as well, so definitely go check those out when you get a chance. But anyways, on to Quad Wobbuffet. So yes, this is definitely a very interesting deck, and like I said, one I actually did choose to play at Internationals. So I figured, let's go over the deck, let's show how it looks in action for any of you guys who are maybe interested when you did see my tournament report. So the whole deck is going to be based around just a Wobbuffet and a bunch of trainers. We don't have energy, any other tech Pokemon or anything, literally just Wobbuffet and a ton of cards to annoy your opponent, basically. So like I said, we have 4 Wobbuffet, and the reason we're playing this, it's a one prize basic with 110 hit points, which is solid, but we're using it for its Bide Barricade ability. So as long as Wobbuffet is your active Pokemon, you turn off non-psychic abilities. So that means we shut off things like PTCGO, Metagross, Vikavolt, Shaman, etc. So it allows us to, kind of disrupt our opponent a little bit. So yeah, moving on to the trainer card, that's going to be the bulk of the rest of the deck. Let's go ahead and start with our, let's do our item cards, I guess. So first up, we have 4 Captivating Pokepuff. Definitely an interesting card we don't see too often. But your opponent reveals his or her hand, and then you put any number of basic Pokemon you find there onto your opponent's bench. So a common thing I've run into with this deck is a lot of times your opponent will hold on to Pokemon that are kind of worthless in the matchup, or they're afraid that you'll Lysander up, so you can use Captivating Pokepuff and put them onto your opponent's bench. That way you can Lysander them up later. And also if your opponent has something like a Tapu Lele or a Shaman, you can put them on your opponent's bench and they actually don't get the effect of their abilities too. So just a very highly disruptive card. But it also has some other uses too. We do run Team Skullgrunt in this list as well. And so knowing what your opponent has in hand is actually very important sometimes to know if you want to Team Skullgrunt or use a different supporter for your turn. So Captivating Pokepuff is a card that I didn't think too much of, but after playing around with it in this deck, it has become a ton of fun. Just constantly putting Shamans and things like that on your opponent's bench, it can really set them back sometimes. Next up we have 4 Crushing Hammer, flip a coin. If heads, discard an energy from one of your opponent's Pokemon. So we're trying to run our opponent out of resources in this deck and eventually just deck them out. So Crushing Hammer is definitely a good card to include for that. We do play Team Flare Grunt in this list, but that only discards energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. So Crushing Hammer will allow us to discard energy from elsewhere on our opponent's field. Also running 4 Enhanced Hammer, which does seem like kind of a high count. Normally this is a card you might only see as like a 2 of, or maybe a 3 of in a disruption deck like this potentially. But we're maxing this out because unlike something like Sylveon GX, we can't search out the disruption card that we want every turn. So we have to kind of run, thick counts of all of our cards to ensure that we always have an outlet hitting them. So that's the main reason we're playing such a heavy count of this card. And since this is only Wobbuffet, we don't have access to things like Tapu Lele or other ways to really dig deep into our deck and find what we need consistently. Next up, 3 Field Blower. Choose 2 stadiums or tool cards in play and discard them. So the main reason we're playing this is to get rid of our opponent's float stones, because there's a lot of times we actually are going to try to Lysander stall our opponent in order to deck them out. And Field Blower will help ensure that our opponent can't keep any float stones in play to have free retreat. But also we don't play a stadium card in this deck, so running a thick Field Blower count kind of ensures that we can pretty consistently have an answer to our opponent's stadium cards. 4 Puzzle of Time. So this is one of those cool dual effect cards. So if you play 1 Puzzle of Time, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, put them back in any order. But if you play 2 of them at the same time, you get to put 2 cards from your discard pile into your hand. So that's the main effect we are going to try to use this for. So this is going to be mainly to get back our item cards. Since we can't Versus Seeker for them, we can Versus Seeker for Flare Grunts and the rest of our supporters, but we can't get things like Crushing Hammer back after we've already used them. So Puzzle of Time will allow us to get around that. And sometimes the first effect is relevant sometimes. Like if you're playing a game and you have one puzzle prized, sometimes, you can use since you have an odd number of puzzles left in your deck, you can burn one of them to look at the top 3 cards of your deck sometimes. So the first effect is still handy in certain situations. Next up we have 2 Rescue Stretcher, another dual effect card. We get to put a Pokemon from our discard pile into our hand, or shuffle 3 Pokemon from our discard pile into our deck. So our opponent has to knock out 4 Wobbuffets and then 2 more. So we can use Rescue Stretcher twice, and if our opponent knocks out 6 Wobbuffets, they win the game. So there's really not too much of a point to run any more Rescue Stretchers than we already are. You also can do some cool plays sometimes if you want, where you shuffle multiple Wobbuffets into your deck and then use Bridget to get them back out. This is especially handy if one of your Wobbuffets is prized and you can't just do the whole, I'm going to let my opponent knock out 4 Wobbuffets and Rescue Stretcher twice to make them take 6 prizes. So if you have Wobbuffets prized, the second effect can be quite handy. So like I said, just to ensure that we always have a Wobbuffet in play. Next up, for Trainer's Mail, look at the top 4 cards of our deck and get a trainer card we find there. So again, this is kind of since we aren't Sylveon, like I mentioned earlier, something like Trainer's Mail is actually handy because it lets us dig a little deeper into our deck and see, what trainer card we actually want to use. Just lets us get a nice little consistency boost. Next up, 4 Reverse Seeker, just to reuse our supporters. And moving on to our supporters, we have 3 Bridget, so search your deck for a basic EX or 3 basic non-EXs and put them onto your bench. So this is good because we can grab all 3 Wobbuffets that are still in the deck and immediately have a fully developed board. And it's also good because we're not playing any ball cards. It allows us to get around, playing a bunch of items like ball search cards like Nest Ball or Ultra Ball. And, it allows us to play around Garbodor. I think that's going to be a very important thing in this deck. Just because Garbodor can somewhat easily one-shot your Wobbuffet. So if you can play supporter cards to get around playing your items to get set up, that is definitely going to be preferred. And Bridget really helps with that. Next up, for Lysander, like I mentioned earlier, we are going to be trying to stall our opponents out and strand things in the active spot. So that's going to be a common way we are going to mill our opponent, just run them out of resources and Lysander up a big target that can't easily retreat. Next up, for Skyla, search your deck for a trainer card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So if you notice, we have 56 trainer cards in this deck, so Skyla does have some merit, I think. But yeah, I think the most important use I found for Skyla was if we already have a Puzzle of Time in hand, we can use Skyla to grab our second Puzzle of Time. That way we can play both of them together. Another use for Skyla is, if we're in a decent spot for the turn, we can always use our supporter, our Skyla as our supporter for turn and grab a different supporter for next turn. But like I said, the most common use I found is to just grab your second Puzzle of Time, or if you're going against a non-Garbodor based deck, you can also just search for a Crushing Hammer for turn, an Enhanced Hammer, etc. So next up, okay, I totally skipped over N, I think, but 4 copies of N just to give ourselves a little bit of shuffle draw, and also in the late game we can disrupt our opponent, put them down to a low hand size, and if our opponent doesn't really have their board developed at that point, we can actually sit back and just Team Rocket's handiwork and mill them while they're stuck with a 1-card hand and an undeveloped board. So those are going to be the main uses for N. But going on to the rest of our disruption supporters, we have 4 Team Flagrant, discard an energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So like I said, we were trying to mill our opponents, and Team Flagrant will allow us to get rid of their resources and ensure that they can't knock out our Wobbuffets as easily. 4 Team Rocket's handiwork, flip 2 coins. For each heads, discard 2 cards from the top of your opponent's deck. I've said this countless times now, we are a mill deck, so this is just a very obvious inclusion to have. And then the last trainer card in the list is going to be 4 Team Skullgrunt. So your opponent reveals their hand, discard 2 energy cards from it, and it's just another way to get rid of our opponent's resources. And like I said, since we play Captivating Pokepuff, we can, get knowledge of our opponent's hand to see if we even want to use Team Skullgrunt. So definitely good. And it also helps against a couple of other matchups, like Greninja, for example, which I hate to say is kind of a horrible matchup for this deck, but Team Skullgrunt does help there. It also helps in things like Volcanion, or basically any deck that runs just a high energy count. Over the weekend when I played in Internationals, just opening with a Team Skullgrunt before your opponent gets their first turn can be very strong, just because they don't have a chance to actually play down their energy yet. You can typically get one or two and put them in the discard pile. Or alternatively, if you have used a bunch of hammers to get rid of your opponent's energy that they have on field, you can still use your supporter for turn to be a Skullgrunt and get rid of any additional energy your opponent might have as well. But yeah, guys, that is the list that we're going to be playing with. This is actually the same list that I used at Internationals. And also just want to give a quick shout out to Grant Manley. He's actually the player who came up with this list. This is I believe the exact list that he came up with. So just want to give a shout out to him. But yeah, this Quad Wobbuffet deck is actually surprisingly good. So if you look at the Tier 1 decks that are currently in the game, we have things like Zoroark, Decidueye, Vikavolt, trying to think, and there's another one, Decidueye, Vikavolt, Zoroark. You have things like Mega Rayquaza. I feel like there's another big one I'm really forgetting off the top of my head. But basically, this deck has a very, very solid matchup against most of the Tier 1 decks that are currently in the game. Espeon Garb will give you some trouble, but in my experience, it's still a winnable matchup. I played against it 3 times at Internationals, and I never lost one of the series, so it is possible. But anyways, I'm going to quit rambling. You guys want to see how this looks in action, so let's get to the battle portion of the video and see how this thing does. Alright guys, so it looks like we have ourselves a game, and our opponent is calling the coin flip. And we do lose the coin flip, which is unfortunate. I think most decks, just in general, do prefer to go first, but especially with this deck, you really need every turn that you can get, because you need that extra turn to potentially get a Bridget off, or maybe even a Team Skullgrunt on turn 1 or something like that, or the Captivating Pokepuff I have currently in my hand. But I think we're okay looking at our opponent's hand. I think we're playing against a Metagross deck, so this actually seems like a decent matchup. But here our opponent starts a Talonflame, which is highly irregular for Metagross. But this could be potentially annoying, since Aero Blitz will be able to give our opponent an out to potentially whatever that we have. But here our opponent just passes, and so I'm actually kind of okay with our hand that we have. Here I think I'm going to Captivating Pokepuff to see what our opponent has in hand. Nothing too crucial, just a couple supporters. But here we can either Lysander or we can use Team Flare. But I think it's better just to use Team Flare here, get rid of our opponent's energy, and force them to play that Sycamore and dig through their deck a little bit to get set up. So here our opponent is going to evolve into a Metang, and we're going to see a Sycamore here. But again, even if our opponent gets some energy down on this Talonflame, I'm not too stressed, because Metagross is actually not a great attacker against our Wobbuffets. So, after it uses an attack to knock out a Wobbuffet, it can't retreat the next turn and power up a new Metagross because of our Buy Barricade ability. So I'm optimistic, but if our opponent were to power up maybe 2 Metagross on the bench, that could be problematic, since we can't Team Flare Grunt them. But let's just see how this goes. Our opponent is going to search their deck for 2 cards with Aero Blitz. But here, what do we have? Just another Lysander. So here I think I'm going to Lysander up this Metang and just pass. Because here our opponent probably won't be able to retreat Metagross or Metang if they just leave it as Metang. But here they're going to evolve into Metagross, and they're going to be forced to, I think, start powering up this active Metagross, and that's actually what I wanted, because we have somehow 3 Versus Seekers, so we can Team Flare Grunt a couple of times and hopefully run this Metagross out of energy. Okay, so they are attaching to the active like I thought, and here we might just see an Algorithm GX to let our opponent search their deck for 5 cards, but honestly, they can get whatever they want. I'm not too worried about it unless they get Olympia. Olympia could be a thorn in our side that could allow them to get out of the active spot. So If we do get an end potentially on the next turn, I might consider playing that since they'll still need 2 attachments on this Metagross to attack. But okay, just another Team Flagrant, so I guess we're just going to keep taking off this energy. So let's see what our opponent does end up having. If they do have Olympia, even still, I think we're in a decent spot because we have another Lysander and 3 Verse Seekers, but here just an attachment, so... And we top deck our first additional Wobbuffet, so we're starting to get kind of set up here. We're stripping away a ton of energy. I think our opponent's gone through 5 already, if I'm counting correctly. So let's see what they have. I would imagine off that Algorithm GX they would have gotten something else other than just more energy. So we're going to bench another Beldum. I'm fine with that. It's just another Lysander target. So here we're going to Team Flagrant yet again. You know, to my opponent's credit, they probably did not expect me to have a Flagrant and 3 Versus Seekers in hand to be able to keep doing this. So they probably were thinking, hey, he's going to run out of these Flagrants after a turn or so, but apparently not. So we're going to Flagrant. I think that's actually the 5th time we've used the card so far. And we're out of our Flagrants, but that's fine because we have Bridget that we can start to get our other Wobbuffets out with. The only thing I'm not happy about are these 3 Enhanced Hammers in hand. That is definitely a pain. Okay, so we are going to Bridget. Definitely grabbing our other 2 Wobbuffets. See, all of our Puzzles of Time are in deck. We have 1 Rescue Stretcher prize, but that's not too big a deal. I'm honestly not sure if our opponent can even take 6 prizes this game. Here we're just going to pass. You know, we could have played the Puzzle of Time to rearrange the top 3 cards, but I really don't think our opponent's putting on enough pressure to warrant that. So we're going to get Trainer's Mail. So we can grab a Verse Seeker or a... Looks like I'm eyeing down Crushing Hammer, but I think Verse Seeker is just better just because we can grab ourselves a Flare Gun instead of having to risk the flip that we would have to do with a Crushing Hammer. So we're going to versus Team Flagrant yet again. So I think all of our Versus Seekers are actually gone, but we still do have our 4 Puzzles of Time left in deck. So we can, you know, maybe dig and get another out reusing Flagrant yet again. So I have to give our opponent credit. They keep managing to get an energy attachment. But here, just going to get Tails on Crushing Hammer. A little unfortunate, but Metagross, like I've said before, it does require 3 energies to attack us, so I'm feeling pretty good. Okay, so we are eyeing down potentially a Puzzle of Time with this Trainer's Mail. I think that's fine. We can play both of these Puzzles of Time and get back a Team Flare Gun and maybe just another Versus Seeker, since, I mean, Flare Gun's really all we need this turn anyways. Yeah, Pokepuff's not too relevant since everything has a big retreat cost on his field. So maybe Crushing Hammer, though. Now, I think just going for the extra Verse Seeker is definitely the play here. So we'll do that. We'll use one of them to use a Team Flare Gun. And I was really worried my opponent was going to scoop at this point because I've had these Flare Guns every turn. And so I got to give credit to our opponent, Raikou1234, for being a good sport and tolerating this deck this long into the match. Since this is the type of deck that people do scoop to on PTCGO because of how annoying it is. Okay, so here we're going to Skyla, and probably just grab Team Rocket's Handiwork. Our opponent doesn't have an energy for us to get rid of, which means they probably don't have an energy in hand either. So we can just take this turn to Skyla for that Team Rocket's Handiwork to start milling them now. And our opponent is starting to hang on to a lot of cards in their hand, so what I'm guessing is they are probably going to try to deck us out by saving all the cards in their hand and then ending us late game once they have a huge hand of a lot of resources. Okay, they're just going to pass to us. That means we can Trainer's Mail here. And, I mean, we really don't need too much here. We could use Skull Grunt because if our opponent is hanging on to the energy that I was just mentioning, we could do that. Or we can just Handiwork this turn as well. So let's see, our opponent's 7 energies in the discard, 1 on field, so I'm not sure if they have energy in hand or not. So let's just go for the Handiwork. And we do get 1 head, so we get rid of a Verse Seeker, which is good because that will definitely limit how many times our opponent can end us. And okay, so just another pass from our opponent. So yeah, I'm definitely thinking they are going the route of just saving their hand to end us. And here's surprisingly no energy. So I really thought for sure we would hit one there, but nevertheless, I'm okay with the spot we're in. Our opponent does not have a means of attacking us, let alone taking out 6 Wobbuffets. So I think we're good as long as we don't get decked out, which could potentially happen because I'm the one that's having to spend resources to deck out our opponent. Okay, so our opponent is going to attach. That's fine. We're just going to Team Flare Grunt them and see it pass. God, and our opponent has a massive hand. We are probably going to see an N in the next couple turns, I would imagine. Probably once they get down to 5 cards in deck seems like a safe bet, but okay, our opponent is just going to go ahead and N us. I think 5 cards is a safe spot though, just in case our opponent, if we Team Rocket's Handiwork them for 2 heads, that'll put them at a 1-card deck. So, alright, so we're going to Pokepuff, see what our opponent has in hand. So nothing too relevant there, so we can Handiwork. Let's do that. We're going to discard 2 cards and pass our turn. Next turn, we can also use Skyla to grab our last puzzle of time and get 2 cards from our discard pile back. So yeah, I think we should do that. Let's go for the Skyla. We could just grab another Handiwork or something like that, but let's go for the puzzles of time. I like that better since we can get Versus Seekers instead. So let's grab 2 Versus Seekers. That way we'll have access to Handiwork or a Team Flare Grunt if we choose to. And just pass on over to our opponent. And what do they have here? Okay, so it looks like they are just going to go for the same strategy they've been going for. And they're actually doing decent with it. They have 14 cards left in deck. I have 21. So it's really not too different. But here our opponent, I guess, just concedes. So I guess they finally just got tired of being disrupted. And if you guys ever do play this deck on PTCGO, definitely be prepared to have people quit on you, since it is a highly annoying deck to play against. But anyways, yeah guys, I hope you enjoyed the look at this Quad Wobbuffet deck. Like I said earlier, if you want to hear my tournament report and how I did at internationals with it, I'll be sure to put a link in the description or in the video somewhere for you to check that out as well. But anyways guys, as usual, feel free to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out our merchandise over at rarecandytcg.com. If you can pick up something to help support the channel, it'd mean a lot to us. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you for the next one.